Now it's time for us to talk about what social media are doing for and what they are doing to our societies. And here's a quick outlook on that.
Disruptive developments, calling for radical innovations. Digitization has sparked dynamic shifts that are changing our everyday lives. Do you want to understand how and why? Let's get to it.
Social media can spark social movements, but it can also be hijacked to spread misinformation. Where does responsibility for content begin and where does it end? Social media inventory.
Yes, where does the power lie and where is the responsibility for all of that? Is social media doing more good, or is it harming our liberal democracies? Whatever it's doing, it's here to stay. And here's my panel, my distinguished panel I can discuss this with today. Philip Howard is Professor of Internet Studies at the Oxford Internet Institute. Foreign Policy magazine calls him a true global thinker, and his books have titles like The Digital Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy and Lie Machines. He says modern politics is no longer conceivable without digital campaigns, open or covert, and he warns that lie machines have become totally normal. With us also is Tobias Schmid. He's director at the Media Authority in the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia, also part of the German media regulator and vice chair of the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services. He says Europe stands for freedom. The internet also promises freedom, but to be free must not mean being without protection. Freedom must be protected through regulation. And from Brazil, we're joined by Felipe Neto. He's a YouTuber who has more than 43 million followers on YouTube, mostly built on off-the-wall videos, looking at video games also. In 2020, he was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential personalities. And currently, he's one of the loudest critics of Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro. He's now also receiving death threats for speaking out. He says it's our hunger for conspiracy, our desire to hear and share lies, because life is very boring when it's only based on truth. Humanity is heading for destruction if the algorithms are not regulated somehow. And I would like to start with Philip Howard. Philip, today we saw a report come out with the FBI warning that QAnon, that conspiracy group in the United States, is now seen as a threat in terms of longing and heading for physical violence in the US, potentially even beyond. Could regulation have stopped a group like that from emerging?
It certainly could have. I think the question is what kind of regulation and who would be the regulator? To some degree, it's actually up to the social media firms themselves to manage this content. They could take much more proactive steps to keep radical voices, the extremist voices, off mainstream social media. And then it's a question of what role government should have. And in the US context, there are actually very few regulators that would have oversight of what QAnon can do, they've shown they can do. So I think the question is an important one. Clearly, we need more oversight, but we're still waiting to see who will show leadership in this domain.
Mr. Schmid, I would like to get to you because the EU already has a long list of regulation that's in place or currently being drafted. We had Vera Jourova, the European Commission Vice President for Values and Transparency, here on the Global Media Forum. She cited the Copyright Directive, the European Democracy Action Plan. What kind of regulation do you feel is the benchmark requirement to use social media in line with democratic standards?
Yeah, hello, thanks for having me. And, it's nice to start with this very simple question, or to say it in another way, that's not so easy to answer. I think we've got to start with the following view. First, of course, our core responsibility in these times is to keep freedom running also in the online world. But as I said before, I think to protect freedom, you also need some rules, because freedom without any rules normally destroys more than it makes possible. So that leads up to the question, who should set up the rules? At the moment, we have mainly rules coming from the industry. And to be honest, from my personal view, I think rules to protect freedom shouldn't come from industry or companies, but from legislators. So that means from parliaments. That's why I think it is up to the European Union, as they do, to ask what is the right, how to say it, legal framework or setting to protect freedom on the one hand and society on the other. And here we have got to differentiate between two different areas. The one is more the area where you have clear illegal content. To be honest, that's not so complicated. You just need a responsible regulator and you need tools, but that's not, how to say, rocket science. And then in the other area, you have this part of disinformation. And that's much more complicated because this is always around the heart of democracy, because disinformation abuses the right of freedom of expression. And at the same time, if we react on that, we always have to be very careful that we not destroy more than we try to protect. So to put it in a nutshell, I think the right way is rules by legislators, meaning parliaments. That's the normal democratic process. And then we need a balanced and graduated system that has very clear rules for illegal content and clear responsibilities, and a very balanced and very careful system in the area of disinformation.
Felipe Neto, as a very successful YouTuber, you benefit from the power of social media, transcending judiciaries as well. Can you just give us an insight in what your daily reality is right now?
I've been making videos for 11 years now, so it's been a long time. And hold on just a second, I'm having trouble with sound. I'm getting back from, like, I'm watching the live and I'm getting my sound back. Should I mute here?
I think we'll just leave you, if you're still getting it right now, I think we'll leave you with our technical people to look at that particular issue and draw you back in when you have a safe line that's not so distorted. I'd go back to Professor Howard. A lot of it is in the detail, isn't it? You look very closely at those details. So when we have the EU debating regulation, are rules needed, or is there some kind of consensus needed first what social media should and should not try to aim for?
Well, I think there is some strong consensus about what we'd like to see the social media firms do. In fact, the European Commission is one of the organizations that has come up with good sets of best practices, and they have a framework that social media firms are supposed to rise to. I do think we're past the point of industry self-regulation. And one of the grand challenges at the moment seems to be managing COVID misinformation. This is content that emerges often from state-backed media agencies in Russia or China. It encourages people to take unusual cures, things that aren't cures, and to spread stories, misinformation about the origins of the virus. And all of this has a very significant and measurable impact on public understanding of the risks involved with accepting public health guidance. So there's clear linkages between the kinds of misinformation you find on social media and some behavioral responses. It is up to the social media firms to manage the content in a more effective way.
Tobias Schmid, you speak to those social media companies. What is the response you're getting?
The good news is I speak to them since about 3 or 4 years, like all the other European regulators. And the good news is now we got a response. So when we started, I have had the impression that they were not so much interested in the perspective of European regulators. And here we have a change. And I think this is one of the positive effects out of the legislative actions coming from the European Union, as well as some of our member states, as Germany and France. And that leads to a situation where we have a dialogue. It's an active and trustful dialogue as far as it can be. But just to come to the point before, I think we now reach a point where we've got to be very clear.
Yeah.
Self-regulation is always
Yeah,
an interesting idea, and I strongly believe in the trust into industries. But nevertheless, if we are talking about stabilizing democracy and securing freedom, then I think it is not only up to self-regulation. We have got to find a smart system of hybrid regulation between self-regulation by companies, but also regulation by media regulators in Europe or the US to stabilize the situation. Because if not, then of course, democracy in the online world is a little bit on risk.
We have Felipe Neto back on the line, so I'm glad that our sound is stable now with you. I'd asked you to give us an insight into your daily reality, and we're already discussing at what level social media companies need to take responsibility. But maybe you first give us an insight into what your daily reality is at the moment in Brazil.
Yeah, so I have 2 points of views that are very distinct from each other because I am a creator, I'm a YouTuber. So the fact that everything was free and you could say whatever you wanted was beneficial to me in terms of creating content that I wanted and saying whatever I want and growing my channel from that. But after I realized that I had a big influence in small children and adolescents and all kinds of ages, actually, I started to create responsibility on what I was saying and talking to people who is specialized in this kind of thing to adapt my content to them. But not everyone thinks like that. And I'm not talking about influencers now. I'm talking about businesses and money and the economic power that these big techs have developing for the last 10 years. So I've been making videos for 11 years now, and I've been everything from the beginning. And the fact that we just didn't create any kind of regulation and trusted the market, and we said, okay, so the invisible hand of the market will take care of everything and will regulate everything from itself. It just failed. It failed. It collapsed enormously. It changed the world. We have right now problems in dozens of countries facing fascism and ultra-right conservative rises, and this kind of violence emerging with conspiracy theories and threats all around the world. And everything came from the lack of regulation. The problem is when you talk about regulation, a lot of people think and raise hands and raise flags, believing that you're talking about communism or changing the entire country, and that's not what we're talking about. I want to be regulated. That's what I believe the internet should be. I think if you have regulations for driving, for example, you can't live in a world where everyone can have a driver's license without any kind of test and you can just take a car and hit someone in the streets, right? The internet is the same way. When you have an account on the internet, you can do damage. You can damage people. You can destroy lives. So it's time for the world to think that this is not just about freedom. It's also about hurting people. We have a rise in suicides all around the world and a lot of indicators that shows it has direct connection with social medias, especially Instagram and other social medias, especially between young girls. So we're talking about people dying. We're talking about regimes changing in countries. We're talking about death threats. So we can't say that it's all about freedom of speech. We also need to take care of people. So I want to be regulated, and I believe in an environment that works on the internet. It will only work with the mix of self-regulation and outside regulation. I don't believe it will work itself.
Professor Hauer, we had Anne Applebaum also here on the GMF just a short while ago, and she, along with others, stressed that it's the dynamics that play a huge role here. So do these dynamics of the actual spread of particular posts, do those need to be changed, or do you need a set of rules that directly apply to content?
Well, I think there's two buckets of regulatory options. One is sort of market-led initiatives, antitrust action, fines, and then there's the content regulation bucket, and that usually requires constant oversight over particular messages. I think that is one of the more problematic options, right? Authoritarian governments manage content closely. My instinct would be to try and use fines, directing revenue to professional journalists, using civil society groups to generate healthy content. I think there are more creative solutions than simply relying on censorship, basically. But Anne Applebaum is right. There is a lot of important context here. One of the things that's changed in the last year or so is that a significant volume of the misinformation that now circulates globally comes from two sources: Russia Today and Sputnik, or CGTN in China. These are the state-backed purveyors of significantly misleading public news, and this content gets circulated quite broadly by artificial accounts, fake accounts, bots, and occasionally a Hollywood star or a prominent politician will recirculate these stories. So we do know where some of these sources are, and it should be able to watch them closely, at least from the point of view of the social media firms where their stories circulate.
I'd like to go back to Tobias Schmid, because the other side of the coin, of course, is the kind of connect social media managed to provide in places like Belarus, where a plane was downed to get a dissident, a reporter, arrested because a totalitarian state is unable to control social media. So how concerned are you that you might not leave enough room for this kind of freedom of speech?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's a very important point. And I just would like to go again one step back to structure what we've heard until now. I think we've got to differentiate really between illegal content, for example, attacking rights of minors or human dignity. This is something where we do not have to discuss if it's allowed or not. There we have already rules. It's more a question of empowering regulators, of enforcing them to execute these rules to protect human beings. And then we are talking about the whole area of disinformation. And this is the, as I said, more complicated area, because here we have always to have in mind that we have to find a balance between protection of society on the one hand and freedom of expression on the other. And therefore, indeed, it's complicated, as you said, and Belarus is an interesting example, because, of course, every regulatory action coming from free countries always, or can always be, how to say, a good reason also for not so democratic systems to say, okay, but if they act against content to protect their system of democracy, then we are also allowed to do so. So that's why I think we have got to be careful, and I would like to bring one aspect into discussion. I think if we are talking about the disinformation part, then we should differentiate between content and techniques. You know, as long as we are talking about content, we've got to realize that democracies have got to live with a lot of content, even if it's not, how to say, nice or constructive. Where I see the line that we could take is if not the content is the problem, not the techniques. If the technique leads to manipulation of relevance, for example, by coordinated inauthentic behavior, meaning by the abuse of non-really existing accounts to generate the impression that the opinion has a relevance that in reality doesn't exist. So I hope it's not too complicated, but I think we've got to be always very careful when we talk about content, as long as it is not clearly illegal. But of course, we've got to find rules for other parts. And I think, as I said, 2 points. The first is transparency. And transparency also means it has got to be transparent if state institutions are intervening. And the second is manipulation of techniques like, for example, coordinated inauthentic behavior, where I see a very high level of responsibility also of the platforms. And beside this, then we have also the normal, so to say, normal kind of disinformation like CGTN in Russia Today. But this is, to be honest, something that exists with or without the online world. So we have the same problem also in the classical broadcasting world. But maybe that's the third point, not to make it too complicated. Thank you.
Back to Felipe and Neto, you yourself have been at the sharp end of a misinformation campaign. As a YouTuber, you're very versatile when it comes to social media. Can you just explain to us what's the way out of this kind of misinformation from where you're sitting?
Yeah. So first of all, I agree with everything that was said. I don't believe that we should have like a strong state just dictating what can and cannot be published on the internet. What I faced, it was it was really hard. It was something that I don't think even my worst enemy should go through. I was associated with pedophilia. I was associated with corrupting minors, and that was officially by the police. I was framed for crimes against national security, and I had to fight all that in the media and in the court. Um, what is happening here in Brazil is something very, very absurd. We have right now the president trying to pass a decree where he will make it forbidden for companies to delete any kind of content. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, they won't be able to delete any kind of post because that's what Brazilian government is right now. They live by fake news. They live by lying to the people. So what I faced and what other people is facing is a strategy of lying. And I agree with the fact that it's really hard to regulate disinformation. It's really hard. But there is clear and checkable lies that can be disproven immediately. So yesterday we had a case in Brazil that was very symbolic. One of these Bolsonaro bloggers, he claims to be a journalist, but he's not. He tweeted that the soccer player Eriksen, I believe everyone saw what happened on the game between Denmark and Iceland, and Eriksen collapsed in the field, right? So people believed he had a heart attack, he had some kind of problem with his heart. He was resurrected in the field by the medics, and he's fine now. This blogger that is pro-government, he tweeted saying that an Italian medic, head of the club where he plays, said in an Italian radio that Eriksen received the COVID vaccine from Pfizer, and it could be connected with the collapse that he had in the field. And he tweeted that is clearly a lie because the team from Inter de Milan, the team from Internazionale, said that Eriksen didn't receive any COVID vaccine. So it was checkable. It was right there. It was a lie. So we reached to Twitter and said, okay, so this is a lie. This is misinformation, and it's connecting a collapse in the field, a heart problem, with the vaccine. And Twitter responded us that the tweet did not break any rules. So when you have social medias that are scared of the government, like they are in Brazil right now, they're avoiding to delete content because they're afraid of our president. And we have a president who is trying to push the boundaries and trying to regulate in the other way, not forbidden fake news, but incentivizing it, like saying it's legal and it shouldn't be deleted. Then we have the biggest of the problems, because we are not talking about taking down bad content. We're talking about keeping them online. And they're using the argument that this is freedom, and they are fighting for freedom. So this is the situation that we have right now in Brazil. It's very hard to look from our perspective. You have to, it's when you're in Germany and United States and other countries who are more developed and you have more information, you have more education, it's a little bit easier to handle with this situation, even though it's very hard. But here in Brazil, we're facing a tragedy. So I urge for people from other countries to look at Brazil, because we have 210 million people and we protect the forest that is really important to the world. Look at Brazil, look at what's happening. I'm not asking for you to intervene, but I'm asking you to talk about what's happening in Jair Bolsonaro's government here in Brazil. This is outrageous, and we are facing a war here. So please look and talk about us.
Right. Thank you very much for that illustration of the situation that you are in right now. Professor Howard, I would like to put that to you, but along with one of our GMF fellows, who is also from Brazil and has asked the following question.
Social media companies became important global political players, but are they able to adapt to the different cultural and political contexts in each country so that their decisions do not interfere with local public spheres? We have seen cases, for instance, where a politician account was suspended and there was retaliation, with governments banning platforms or even shutting down the internet entirely. And this has obviously negative implications for the groups that use these platforms as a tool for democracy. So how can social media companies and regulators face this challenge? Thank you.
Professor Howard, please.
What a fabulous question. And in an important way, we need a little more standardization in how firms respond and a little bit more local context. So we need the local context in that when an election is run in a country, most of the time, most countries, Facebook does not have a local policy team. They might have a PR team or a local country rep, but they don't assign enough staff to actually monitor the political culture, watch the debates, and have some sense of the nuance that's needed in making those difficult decisions. So at sensitive moments for democracies, the staff need to be there and in place in many different languages in many parts around the world. One of the odd things we've noticed, however, is that sometimes the social media firms will try creative things, and they've had plenty of good initiatives, but they'll try those initiatives in one country, but not offer them in others. So they'll try an aggressive get out the vote campaign in Canada, where I'm from, but they won't run it in Australia. Or they'll respond well to government prompts to regulation in Australia, but they won't respond well in Tunisia when Tunisia has an election. We've just done another study of Ghana and found very similar things. Civil society groups eager to engage with social media firms to ask for help keeping extremists at bay. But the creative projects that they do offer in the US to get out the vote, they don't offer in other parts of the world. So getting some consistency for how social media firms support democracy, especially during elections, that would be one of the things I'd advocate for.
Great, thank you very much for that. I also have a question from one of our fellows for Felipe and Neto. Let's take a look at that. Oh, well, we don't have that coming up. What kind of regulation are you, Felipe and Neto, asking for? Be careful what you wish for. And please be brief.
That's very common here in Brazil. Yeah, sure. Sorry. The regulation that we're claiming is, first of all, it's the first rule is rules shouldn't come from industry. It was one of the first sentences said here, and I agree entirely. When we leave the power entirely for the companies, the big techs, the money will provide. The money will say what can be shown and what can't. And that led us to the situation we are now. I believe the regulation should come from specialists talking about it constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I believe in international and national committees that are based on specialists with representatives from the people, from the companies, from the specialists, from the science academic field, and they should discuss and decide what should be regulated and what shouldn't, and talk about those issues with international committees as well. So I believe we are so far away from the right way for doing things properly that is very hard to just give a solution. So we need to discuss and talk about it. And I'm not talking about direct orders from the president like it's happening right now in Brazil. So that is the only way that I see it working, is talking with specialists and bringing committees together to discuss the issues and find the solutions. It's not from me. I don't have the answer. No one has the answer. Just personally, we need to discuss more.
Thank you very much for that. And we're just doing a quick closing round. I just want to ask all three of you, starting with Mr. Schmid, if the regulation fairy came along and could basically take away one aspect of social media just like that, and I'm asking for a 1 or 2 word answer, what would that be? We'll start with Mr. Schmid and then Professor Howard and then Felipe Neto, please.
Pooh. I think there is nothing to take away. It is just as Felipe said, we need standards to keep free in the online world, and these standards have got to come from parliaments. And at the end, the core rule is we have got to respect rules to keep free, and I think that's the core message.
Okay, Professor Howard, it's not often that academics get asked what they wish for.
Well, then you won't be surprised that my answer has to do with data, right? The social media firms hoard data. They don't share with professional journalists. They don't. The best data on public life isn't with the government. It's not in the National Library. It's in Silicon Valley. And I would encourage more privacy protecting sharing of social media data that they keep largely to themselves.
Okay, Felipe, your wish.
Same answer, transparency. I think the digital world will only change when we start talking about transparency of algorithms, of data, and everything that is being kept record, and just showing it to the world and discussing on what to do with it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all three of you.